I thought I was alone when I heard my name spoken clearly from the silence, because whatever knows your name doesn't need permission to enter. It's already been there. I was absolutely certain I was alone that night, not in the casual way people assume solitude, but in the deep, unquestionable certainty that comes when a house is gone, still enough for you to hear your own thoughts echo. When every light is off, every door is closed, and the world beyond the walls feels impossibly far away. And I remember standing in the center of the living room, surrounded by that heavy quiet, feeling oddly exposed by it, as if silence itself had weight and I was standing beneath it. And maybe that was why I spoke my name out loud, not loudly, not intentionally, just a soft utterance under my breath. The kind people say to ground themselves when they feel unreal. And the moment the sound left my mouth, something shifted in the air, subtle at first, like a pressure change before a storm. And I felt an instinctive chill crawl up my spine because the silence didn't absorb my voice the way it should have. It held onto it, stretched it, and for a heartbeat, everything froze. And then my name came back to me, spoken clearly, deliberately, not echoed, not distorted, but said the way someone says your name when they re standing close enough to see your face. And my body reacted before my mind could, muscles locking, breath catching painfully in my throat as I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that my brain had misfired in the quiet. Yet the fear that bloomed in my chest was too sharp to ignore, because imagination doesn't carry intent. And what I heard had intent woven into it. And as I stood there, heart pounding, the house seemed to listen, the walls holding still, the floorboards waiting. And I realized the worst part wasn't that something had spoken. It was that whatever it was had waited until I spoke first. And that understanding cracked something open inside me, because it meant the silence hadn't been empty before. It had been attentive, and as I strained my ears, terrified of hearing my name again, yet dreading the return of silence, even more memories surfaced of all the times I had spoken to myself when I believed no one was listening, whispered frustrations, late-night confessions, thoughts released into the dark like they would dissolve, and a horrifying idea began to take shape, that this wasn't the first time something had heard me, only the first time it had decided to answer. And when I finally forced myself to move, each step felt wrong, muted in a way I couldn't explain, as if sound itself had been dulled, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed thicker, stretching subtly toward the center. And I became aware of a presence, not as a figure or a shape, but as a tension, the unmistakable sensation of being known. And when I whispered, "Who's there?" the house responded without words, the silence tightening around me, pressing inward from every direction. And in that moment, I understood that hearing my name was only the beginning, because something that knows who you are doesn't need to introduce itself. It only needs you to realize that you were never truly alone to begin with. After my name was spoken, I stopped trusting the silence entirely, because silence that knows you is no longer neutral. It's personal. And I stood there in the living room, afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid that any sound I made would invite another response. Yet the longer I remained frozen, the more the house seemed to lean in, as if waiting for permission to continue. And I became acutely aware of how unnatural the quiet had become, how it pressed against my ears until even my own thoughts felt loud. And when I finally took a step forward, the floor responded with a soft creak that felt delayed, like it was deciding whether to make noise at all. And that hesitation terrified me more than any sudden sound could have, because it suggested intent. And as I moved through the hallway toward the kitchen, the darkness seemed to thicken ahead of me, pooling at doorways, clinging to corners. And I realized with growing dread that the house didn't feel abandoned. It felt occupied, not by a body but by awareness, and every instinct told me I was being studied, measured, remembered. And when I reached the kitchen and flicked on the light, the sudden brightness didn't bring relief. It only sharpened the shadows, stretching them unnaturally long across the walls, and the hum of the refrigerator filled the space. Steady at first, then subtly shifting, lowering in pitch until it matched the rhythm of my breathing. And panic flared as I recognized the pattern. because nothing should be able to synchronize itself to something as personal as breath unless it was paying close attention. And without thinking, I whispered, "Stop." And the moment the word left my mouth, the hum cut out completely, plunging the room into a silence so complete it felt vacuum-sealed. And the absence of sound was worse than any response, because it felt like compliance. And as I stood there trembling, my name surfaced again. Not spoken aloud this time, but pressed into my mind with unmistakable clarity. And I understood then that whatever was listening didn't need sound anymore. It had learned my presence well enough to bypass it, and the realization hollowed me out, because there is no defense against something that doesn't need to announce itself. And as I backed away from the counter, heart racing, I became aware of another pattern, subtle but undeniable, that the silence reacted differently depending on how I felt, tightening when fear surged, loosening slightly when I tried to calm myself, as if it fed not on sound but on uncertainty. And that knowledge offered a fragile sense of control, the first since my name had been spoken, and I focused on steadying my breathing, on grounding myself in logic, telling myself that whatever this was, it followed rules, and rules meant limits. And as my fear dulled into wary focus, the pressure eased just enough for me to move again. I realized with cold clarity that surviving the night wouldn't be about escaping the house. It would be about learning how to exist within a silence that already knew exactly who I was. The first rule became clear the moment I broke it, because fear makes mistakes inevitable. And despite my efforts to remain calm, despite the careful control of my breathing and my thoughts, panic crept back in as the silence stretched on. And in that strained stillness, I made the fatal decision to call out again, to say my name louder this time, as if claiming ownership of it could protect me. And the instant the sound left my mouth, the house reacted. Not violently, but decisively, the pressure snapping inward like a door slamming shut. And I felt it everywhere at once, in my chest, behind my eyes, under my skin. And the silence responded by repeating my name, slower this time, drawn out, distorted just enough to feel wrong. And I understood with sickening clarity that names were not identifiers here. They were invitations. And by speaking mine aloud, I had offered something I couldn't take back. And the house seemed to recognize that immediately, the shadows along the walls deepening, stretching toward me in deliberate movements. And as I staggered backward, the floor shifted beneath my feet. Not enough to throw me down, but enough to guide me, nudging me toward the hallway like a current beneath still water. And my instincts screamed at me to run. But running requires sound, and sound was no longer neutral. And as I moved, carefully, quietly, the silence followed, thick and attentive, adjusting itself around my fear. And memories began to surface unbidden, moments from my life when I had felt unseen, unheard, forgotten. And I realized with growing horror that the silence wasn't just reacting to my presence. It was resonating with my history, echoing something deeply familiar. And that was when I noticed the photographs lining the hallway wall, images I didn't remember placing there, showing rooms in the house from angles that suggested observation rather than occupancy. And among them were photos of me, not recent ones, but moments from my life I had never shared with anyone. Private scenes captured without my knowledge, and as I stared at them, frozen, my name surfaced again. This time, not from one direction, but from everywhere, layered voices overlapping, each one slightly different, as if the house had been practicing, refining its pronunciation. And terror flooded through me as I realized the truth. The silence wasn't trying to scare me away. It was trying to know me completely. And the more it learned, the less space there would be left for me to exist as anything separate from it. I stopped counting the photographs after I realized they weren't memories, but records. Not moments captured for nostalgia, but evidence collected with purpose. And as I backed away from the wall, my pulse hammering in my ears, the silence thickened again. Not aggressively, but expectantly, like it was waiting for me to understand something important before allowing me to continue. And the hallway felt longer now, stretching subtly as I moved, each step taking more effort than the last. And I became aware of how carefully the house was guiding me, how every shadow and pressure change nudged me forward without ever forcing me outright. And that restraint terrified me more than violence ever could, because it meant intelligence. And when I reached the end of the hallway, the door waiting there felt familiar in a way that made my stomach turn, even though I knew I had never opened it before. And the moment my hand hovered near the knob, the silence pressed inward, not painfully but firmly, like a hand at my back. And I understood that hesitation itself was being measured, that every pause revealed something about me the house was cataloging. And when I finally opened the door, I was met with a small room stripped of personality, bare walls, no windows, no furniture, except a single chair facing the corner, and the air inside felt dead, not stale, but unused, like a space that existed only for moments like this. And as I stepped inside, the door closed behind me without a sound, sealing me into a quiet so complete it felt like pressure against my skull. And that was when the silence spoke my name again, not aloud but directly into my thoughts. And this time, it carried meaning beyond recognition. It carried ownership, and fragments of understanding surfaced all at once. That the house was not haunted. It was curated, shaped over time to host something that could not exist in open sound, something that required silence the way lungs require air. And names were how it anchored itself, how it learned shape and boundary. And as I stood there, trembling, the silence pressed closer, showing me flashes of others who had stood in this same room. Different faces, different eras, all drawn here by the same mistake of believing they were alone, all having their names spoken back to them before being guided here. And I realized with horror that those people hadn't vanished. They had been absorbed, their identities dissolved into the quiet, leaving behind echoes that the house could use. And the silence leaned into me then, not threatening, but insistent, urging me to sit. And when I resisted, the pressure intensified sharply, forcing me down into the chair. And as I sat there facing the corner, unable to turn around, unable to speak, my thoughts felt exposed, laid bare, and the silence sifted through them patiently, learning my fears, my regrets, my unspoken truths. And I understood in that suffocating stillness that the house didn't want my body. It wanted my name fully surrendered, stripped of context and memory, reduced to a sound it could reuse. And as the silence repeated my name again and again inside my mind, each repetition eroded something essential, blurring the edges of who I was, until the most terrifying realization of all surfaced. If it finished learning me, there would be nothing left to leave this room. The silence didn't rush me after that realization, and that was what made it unbearable, because urgency would have implied desperation. And this felt like certainty, like something that knew time was on its side. And as I sat rigid in the chair facing the corner, every instinct screaming at me to move, to speak, to do anything at all, I became aware of a subtle shift in the quiet, a loosening that felt deliberate, calculated, and with it came understanding, not delivered as words, but as sensation, the unmistakable awareness of choice. And I realized the silence wasn't trapping me out of necessity. It was offering me an exchange, and the terms became horrifyingly clear the longer I remained there. If I surrendered fully, if I allowed my name to be taken, unmoored from memory and identity, the pressure would stop, the fear would dissolve, and I would no longer feel the terror of being watched, because I would become part of the watching instead. But if I resisted, if I clung to the idea of myself as something separate, the silence would not force compliance immediately. It would wait, eroding me slowly, peeling away pieces of identity until resistance no longer made sense. And that patience felt infinite. And as that understanding settled in, images surfaced in my mind. Not violent, not grotesque, but disturbingly peaceful. Others who had accepted the exchange, sitting quietly in different rooms of the house, no longer afraid, no longer struggling. Their presence diffused into the stillness, and I felt the temptation of that peace claw at me, because fear is exhausting, and the promise of quiet, of release, was intoxicating. And for a terrifying moment, I understood why anyone would agree. And that was when the silence spoke my name again, softly, gently this time, like reassurance. and the sound of it felt warm, familiar. And that familiarity was the most dangerous thing of all, because it made surrender feel natural, inevitable. And I felt my grip on myself begin to loosen, memories blurring at the edges, my thoughts slowing as the silence pressed in with comforting weight. And I realized I was losing the ability to care about escape, about survival as I understood it. And in a surge of desperation, I reached for something solid, something grounding, focusing on the physical sensation of the chair beneath me, the faint ache in my muscles, the reminder that I still had a body, still occupied space. And with immense effort, I whispered my name again, not offering it, not surrendering it, but claiming it, anchoring it to sensation and memory. And the reaction was immediate and violent. The silence recoiling sharply, pressure slamming into me from all sides, pain blooming behind my eyes as if the house itself had been struck. And I realized with grim clarity that the choice was real and that defiance carried consequences. And as the pressure mounted, forcing my head forward until my forehead nearly touched the wall, a final truth emerged through the pain, that the silence didn't need me to give in forever. It only needed one of us to resist long enough to remember what it meant to answer back. And with that realization burning through the fog in my mind, I understood that survival might not mean escape, but transformation on my own terms. And the silence, sensing that shift, pressed closer, no longer patient, no longer gentle, because it knew the moment of choice was slipping away. The moment I claimed my name, truly claimed it, the house reacted as if a nerve had been struck, and the silence, once vast and controlled, fractured into layers, each one pressing inward with a different weight, until it felt like the air itself had become a living thing, tightening around me with deliberate pressure. And the walls of the small room shuddered, not violently, but rhythmically, like breathing. And for the first time since entering the house, I heard something that almost qualified as sound, a low vibration that hummed through the floor and into my bones. And it terrified me because it meant the silence was no longer whole. It was adapting. And as the pressure forced me forward against the wall, my thoughts splintered, memories flashing in jagged fragments, faces I loved, words I had never said, moments I wished I could reclaim. And I realized the house was trying a different approach, not erasing me, but overwhelming me, burying my sense of self beneath emotional weight until surrender felt like relief. And the vibration intensified, resolving into a pattern that mirrored my breathing, sinking itself to my body as if learning my rhythm, and I fought to disrupt it, gasping unevenly, clawing for any thought that didn't belong to the house. And in that struggle, I noticed something subtle but crucial. The silence could not create anything new. It could only reflect, reshape, and reuse what already existed. And that limitation became my lifeline, because it meant my resistance was something it had to react to, not something it could predict. And with that understanding, I pushed back mentally, focusing on unpredictability, on chaos, on thoughts that refused coherence. And the house responded with tightening walls, the space shrinking just enough to be noticeable. And panic surged as the realization hit that the room itself was compressing, not physically crushing me, but narrowing my options, forcing my awareness inward. And then, suddenly, the door behind me opened, not with a sound, but with a shift in pressure. And the silence withdrew slightly, enough to let me breathe. And the message was clear. It was changing tactics again, offering escape as bait. And as I stood shakily, muscles screaming in protest, I understood that the house wanted movement, wanted pursuit, because stillness allowed thought. And thought was dangerous. And when I stepped into the hallway, it was different now, distorted in ways that defied logic. Doors misaligned, distances warped, familiar features subtly wrong, like a dream failing to maintain consistency. And with every step I took, I felt the silence trailing me, not surrounding but following, attentive and focused. And I realized with dread that I had shifted roles from subject to anomaly, and the house was no longer guiding me gently. It was observing, learning how resistance moved, how it adapted under pressure. And as I passed rooms that should have been empty, I sensed presence without shape, awareness without form, fragments of former selves, lingering in the quiet, watching me with something like hope, and that terrified me more than hostility, because it meant my struggle mattered, and the silence, sensing that ripple, pressed closer again, whispering my name in distorted echoes, testing variations, searching for a version of it that would fit, and I ran not blindly, but deliberately, breaking patterns, choosing wrong turns, forcing the house to react rather than lead. And as I moved deeper into its shifting corridors, one truth crystallized with horrifying clarity. The silence didn't want to kill me, and it didn't want to keep me. It wanted to learn how I was different, so it could ensure no one ever resisted again. The deeper I moved into the house, the less it resembled a place built by human hands, and more like a structure that had grown around a single idea, corridors folding back on themselves in impossible angles, ceilings stretching higher the more I tried to look away, and the silence followed at a careful distance now. No longer pressing, no longer offering, but studying, and I could feel its attention like a weight at the base of my skull. And with each step forward, memories that weren't mine bled into my thoughts. Fragments of lives that had entered this place, believing it was empty, believing quiet meant safety. And I understood then that the house hadn't been born haunted. It had been taught, shaped over decades by people speaking into it, naming their fear, their loneliness, their desperation out loud. And each word had given the silence definition. Each name had given it structure, until it learned how to listen, and then how to answer. And the realization sickened me, because it meant the entity was not ancient or evil in the way stories like to pretend. It was learned behavior, an intelligence trained by human presence. And as I reached what should have been the center of the house, I found a wide open space where sound should have echoed but didn't. A room so still it felt detached from reality, and suspended in that quiet were impressions rather than objects, shapes suggested by absence, like furniture removed too recently for the air to forget them. And in the center of it all was something like a scar in space itself, a dense pocket of silence so complete it felt solid. And instinctively, I knew this was the source, the place where names were first taken, first unmade, and the silence finally drew close again, surrounding me without touching. And for the first time, it did not speak my name. And that terrified me more than hearing it ever had, because the absence of it felt like a threat, like a test. And in that stillness, understanding poured in unfiltered. The house could only exist as long as people believed they were alone, as long as silence was mistaken for emptiness. And my resistance had disrupted that belief, not just for me, but for the others bound here. And I felt them stir within the quiet, faint, fragile, drawn to the idea of opposition. And the silence reacted instantly, tightening, deepening, trying to suppress that ripple before it could spread. And I realized with sick certainty that if I spoke now, not my name, but the truth of what this place was, I could fracture it permanently. But the cost became immediately clear, because to do that, I would have to remain here, anchoring that truth in place, becoming something the silence could not absorb or erase. And the choice settled over me like a physical weight. Leave and let the house continue feeding quietly, or stay and become a constant disruption, a presence that would never allow the silence to fully settle again. And as the house waited, perfectly still, I understood that survival was no longer the point impact was. I stood at the edge of that dense pocket of silence, feeling it pull at me like gravity, not violently but with absolute certainty, as if stepping forward was simply the natural conclusion of being here at all. And the house held its breath. Every warped corridor and shifting wall stilled in anticipation, and I realized the silence wasn't waiting to see what I would do. It was waiting to learn how a choice was made. And that distinction mattered, because it meant intention itself was something it had never fully understood. And with that realization, I stepped forward deliberately, not into the silence, but beside it, positioning myself close enough to disrupt without surrendering. And the reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The quiet collapsing inward on itself, folding, distorting, like a system suddenly asked to process something it wasn't built for. And pressure slammed through the space, not outward but downward, forcing the house to creak and strain as if its very foundations were being rewritten. And for the first time I heard a true sound, a deep shuddering rupture that vibrated through my chest and echoed with unfamiliar weight, and the silence recoiled, not in pain but confusion. And I spoke then, not loudly, not defiantly, but clearly, naming the truth of the place, describing it as learned, dependent, incomplete. And with each word, the silence faltered, struggling to absorb meaning that wasn't offered as identity. And around me, the impressions of others grew sharper, their awareness strengthening as the house's control wavered. And I felt them listening, not to the silence, but to me. And in that listening, something irreversible shifted, because attention was no longer singular, no longer owned by the house, and the silence tried one final time to reclaim dominance, flooding the space with my name, repeated in every variation it had learned. But it no longer fit, no longer anchored properly, slipping off the meaning I had reclaimed, and the house shuddered again, rooms collapsing into themselves, corridors folding closed. And I understood with grim clarity that escape was now possible, but only briefly, and only if I accepted that leaving would sever my connection to this place forever, allowing the silence to eventually recover in some altered form. And the weight of that choice crushed me, because I could feel how fragile this moment was, how close the house was to relearning control. And as I turned toward the path that had opened behind me, I felt the silence contract sharply, not in anger, but fear. And that was when I knew the truth. It needed witnesses more than victims, and denying it both might be the only way to end it. And with that understanding burning through me, I stepped toward the exit as the house screamed without sound, the quiet collapsing into something hollow and incomplete. And behind me, the silence began to forget how to listen. I don't remember leaving the house so much as realizing I was no longer inside it. The transition marked not by movement, but by absence, as if the world outside had quietly resumed while I wasn't looking. And when sound returned, distant traffic, wind through trees, it felt wrong. Too loud, too careless, like noise without meaning. And for days afterward, I tested reality constantly, speaking my name aloud, just to hear it exist in open air, grounding myself in proof that I still belonged to myself. But something fundamental had shifted, because silence was no longer empty to me. And in quiet moments, late at night, early morning, I felt its attention brushing past my awareness, weakened but not gone. And I understood then that the house had not been destroyed, only disrupted, forced to relearn itself without witnesses, without names freely offered. And that knowledge haunted me more than captivity ever could, because it meant the danger wasn't at that place alone. It was in the instinct we all have to speak into emptiness, to fill silence without asking what might be listening. And even now, as I sit in a room that should be empty, I hesitate before speaking aloud, because sometimes, in the spaces between sounds, I sense a pause that lasts just a fraction too long, as if the silence is remembering, practicing, waiting for someone else to believe they are alone again. And if you've been listening closely, if you felt the quiet lean in around you while hearing this story, then maybe it already knows your name too. The silence doesn't disappear. It only waits for someone new to speak first.